Hey, welcome back to Friends in Austin. Today I have Jay Maguire on the podcast. Jay, I know that you really want to legalize hemp in Texas, right?
Well, so hemp is legal in Texas.
Okay.
I don't want you to get off on the wrong. No, I don't want to get off on the wrong foot by making you think that I'm trying to legalize marijuana in Texas. But you've got two plants. They're both in the cannabis family. Hemp is an agricultural product that has many, many, many uses, including extraction of compounds that we use for medicinal purposes, wellness purposes, let's say. And the one that everybody seems to know about is CBD, cannabidiol. That you see CBD ointments, tinctures, oils, gummies.
I use the tinctures every day now.
Do you?
Makes a huge impact on just feeling relaxed and reducing anxiety.
I've heard that from a lot of friends. I use one. I use an oil that's made here in Austin by a company called Santi Labs. It's a member of the Texas Hemp Federation. Santi is actually a laboratory company that tests the products for, firstly, THC, which is present in marijuana but not in hemp. In Texas and in most states, legal products have to be below 0.03% THC. So a very barely measurable amount is permitted. If you're over that, then you have to destroy your crop and destroy your product right now under the current regulations, which is, we can get there in a minute because that's what we're trying to change.
Okay, I have a quick question about that then,
Yeah.
because I had no idea that it was on the plant level. My assumption, because I've seen the tinctures and I've seen it say less than 0.3, 0.03 or 0.3.
Yeah, 0.3, sorry.
Less than
Yeah.
0.3. But I figured that like they took the marijuana plant, like extracted some stuff out of it and they could reduce it at that stage in the process. But you're saying at the growth stage of the process, the plant itself.
You are absolutely correct that it is possible and indeed sensible to, the process is called remediation. So if you have a crop that is tests hot, what you should be able to do is extract everything out of it and then remove the THC and discard it. But current Texas Department of Agriculture rules don't permit that. And that is mostly a function of the newness of the industry to the state. We just harvested our first hemp crop in a century in this state. So TDA, Texas Department of Agriculture, is trying to be as helpful to agriculture and farmers as possible. At the same time, they've got a public policy mandate, because marijuana is still illegal. And it was a major concern of, I think it's fair to say, the governor's office and other state leadership, that hemp not be used as a stealthy way to legalize pot, because they're two different discussions. A perfectly legitimate public policy discussion around marijuana going on all over the country, and it's being legalized, and that is going to happen here. But hemp, which is where we started 2 years ago when the last legislature adopted the new law legalizing hemp, that the state legislature followed Congress legalizing it at the national level.
I didn't even realize that it was legalized at the national level.
It had to be legalized at the national level first.
Okay.
And then the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Texas Department of Agriculture adopted joint rules. So USDA issued federal guidelines, and then the states all have the ability to adopt rules that comport with the federal law. So in Texas, though, because things, we just sort of do things a little bit differently, this concept of remediation hasn't been a crisis yet, because we haven't had a crop that people have had to burn. But farmers have been worried all along that they could plant their crop, and then depending on weather conditions, particularly rainfall and heat, and the amount of time it takes to cut the plant, dry the plant, process the plant, the THC level rises and falls just naturally. And so really, in fairness, it's just a matter of equity for these guys. They don't want to have to, destroy their entire investment. So one of the things that we're going to be asking, and mind you, I'm not saying that the state agencies responsible here, the Department of State Health Services or the Texas Department of Agriculture, are pushing a you got to burn it agenda. It's just that we are very worried that that is a possibility. And so one of the keys, though, to knowing whether you're hot on THC and to knowing whether there are heavy metals in the end product or anything else in the end product. And one of the keys to actually the consumer knowing what they're buying in terms of how much CBD or CBG or CBN, the other, there's other products out there now that are coming online, is testing. So I started off by referring to Santi Labs. Santi is a state-of-the-art laboratory here in Austin, Texas. It's funded through a hedge fund. Guy in, I think he's from New York, from Wall Street, had cancer, decided to change his life. So he got into wellness and saw that CBD and hemp/marijuana botanicals were helping people more than opioids in managing pain. And, we have the added benefit of managing anxiety with these things. So he put together a team, and they're pretty amazing. You walk into their lab it's over by the airport, and these machines are, $500,000 liquid and gas chromatography machines that can tell you everything that is in the sample down to the elemental level. And that's exactly what's needed. Well, so here's the catch. 99% of the products that you see out there on the market aren't tested. And one of our responsibilities as an industry, as the Texas Hemp Federation, is to educate the public about know what you're buying. You don't have an industry standard, at least not in Texas yet, about, say, like a nutrition label that would tell you what's in the bottle verified by a lab report. If you go to a marijuana dispensary in Colorado, a lot of times they'll attach like a package insert that'll have the lab report on it. So it's a third-party lab that has taken the sample, tested it, and gives you the report. So you know that you're getting, X number of milligrams or milliliters of THC or whatever, whatever it is you're buying. You don't know that right now unless you're buying from a trusted source. And so educating people about that is really important. So one of the things that we do in public affairs is we think of ways to reach the public, like coming on your podcast could be considered a public outreach, public education. We've commissioned a 10-part video series that we're calling Texas Hemp from Seed to Shelf. I've hired a young student filmmaker from the University of Texas. He's a radio television film major, and he's working on that series right now.
Very cool.
Yeah, very cool. The first video, which I'll send you a link to later on.
Yeah, do that.
Takes one of our stakeholders, a company called Wild Seed Hemp. They're out near me in Southwest Austin. He's got a couple of acres under cultivation. And just interviews him out in his field, talking about, why he's growing hemp, what he believes it's good for, and some of the issues around it that we need to fix in a public policy sense. And, the 2, 3, or 4 videos from now, we're going to talk about, I don't know exactly how to frame it, but it's kind of like food fraud. When you're buying it's kind of famous, you buy olive oil, a lot of the times what's on the label isn't what's actually in the bottle, especially if it's coming from Italy, for example, where the industry was sort of famously hijacked by the mafia, and they were just passing off like really cheap vegetable oil mixed in with a little olive oil. So billions and billions of dollars get stolen that way. With this stuff, since it's being used for medicinal purpose, it's especially important for people to know that they're going to get the benefit out of it, especially because it's really expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is.
Spend $100 and $150 a bottle on it and not actually get what you're paying for. That's a problem too. And we don't want to see that as an industry. It's our job to try to make sure that the public has faith in the products. So the keys to that are, educating the public about testing, what they should expect when they're buying stuff. And we'll be doing a video at the laboratory to explain, what's in it and what to look for and what to avoid.
So why is it that, you go to like the pharmacy at HEB and you buy vitamins or you buy whatever and it lists every single thing. Why is CBD not have that?
Not there yet.
Yeah.
That's why. It's brand new.
Okay.
That's really what it is. And you've got a lot of, I'm not going to say that they're disreputable. They're new companies that are not big pharmaceutical companies or big nutraceutical companies have products on the market. Now, not to say that nutraceutical companies or nootropics companies don't have products of their own, but like Santi's product Reset is, to me, like should be industry standard of, verification of content and quality of product. But anybody can extract hemp oil and, distill the CBD out and mix that into a tincture or mix that into a lotion. And we're just not there yet as an industry.
So I don't know anything about all this stuff. I would have thought that to put a product like that on market, you would be legally required to do so. You're not?
What I'm saying is that I think that you should have a lab report on everything that you put in your body.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the case just yet. Mm-hmm. You have to have testing though.
And the government, whether it be federal or state, doesn't enforce that.
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. And so, to sort of generate the political will necessary if we need new regulations, sometimes industries will self-regulate by developing best practices, and then it's just encouraging everybody to adopt them, and the market moves you towards them. And in that case, like educating the consumers about what they really should be looking for is a way to pressure industry to going into a best practices situation. The other thing is government regulation, where you have to educate the public enough to reach out to policymakers, legislators and elected officials and bureaucrats, in this case, like a TDA. The rulemaking process always has opening for public comment. And, we tell people, if you use these products and you have a concern or you have something you really want them to know, I'll point them in that direction. Usually it's like an electronic thing where you can just write up what you've got to say. And believe it or not, your legislators, your government agencies pay attention to that stuff. That's feedback from voters and from citizens. And, like in our case, I don't think we have some enormous grievance we're trying to redress. We're trying to avoid problems and like put this industry on its best foot forward. What we want to do is get CBD consumers who feel like this is really an important part of their lives. If you're a daily user, you know what I mean. You don't want that product to go away.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Like say vape is going away in a lot of places, and I could easily envision a scenario where something like that could happen to us. So,
why is this so important to you?
Partly because I believe very strongly in harm reduction. I grew up in the 1980s under a propaganda campaign called Just Say No. It came right out of the White House. President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan very sincerely believed that if they stigmatized drug use, it would prevent youth from developing the habit. But I think the unintended or perhaps hidden agenda there, I don't know which, was that we lost, decades worth of research on marijuana. I was taught in school falsely that marijuana has no medical applications. And we know that's just a plain lie. And that came right out of our government from the very top levels all the way down to school kids. So my generation, and I think like my cohort, kind of bought into this because the kids that came in before us were still long-haired pot smokers, and we were more of the preppy, aspirational young Republican group in the late 1980s. And then it took me decades to kind of get over the idea that if you smoke pot, you were, all these cultural assumptions about people, lacking in ambition, pot makes you stupid. You can't run a business. You should never ever trust somebody who's a pot smoker. And I was probably in my 30s before I realized that I had friends who had like car notes and mortgages and kids and really responsible jobs and small businesses who, instead of coming home and drinking, a scotch or a bottle of wine, would just rip a few bong hits and were completely chill and functional. Mm-hmm. And so the reality was sort of staring me right in the face, like, okay, something's wrong here. But what got me from there onto the notion that harm reduction is an important concept that gets lost in our democratic sausage making machine and public policy and legislation, was that my father got lung cancer from smoking cigarettes. Mm-hmm. I had been working at a law firm in Washington, D.C. As the non-lawyer, for lack of a better term, legislative rep. My job was to help clients that had issues that crossed over into Congress or state legislatures, develop capacity in those places. So if they needed representation, I'd develop a strategy for their problem, and then I'd find people to go and execute it. And we had a company in Virginia that this is following the 46 state tobacco lawsuit. This 46 states joined together, sued the big tobacco companies, hauled them in front of Congress, where the executives famously swore under oath that they didn't believe that nicotine was addictive. And, through that lawsuit and the congressional hearings, decades worth of evidence came out that these really bad companies knew that nicotine was addictive. So people had limited personal agency over the choice to continue using it, but also knew that tobacco smoke was deadly and concealed that fact. And, early on even used doctors to recommend smoking. But what's lost in that, right? Because it took tremendous organization and activism to tear down the normalization of cigarettes in this country. What's lost in that is that nicotine actually has its upsides, and people use it for a reason. Like,
I saw something that said that it outperformed like any other over-the-counter performance enhancing or focus drug, like just straight up nicotine.
I completely believe that because I used to smoke years ago, and I have vapes. My wife vapes. Get to that part of the story in a minute, but yeah, I think it's good for focus. I think people really use it to self-medicate for anxiety and depression. And I know that was my dad's, he had a tough life, was from a working class background, from Worcester, Mass, 5 brothers. None of them got an opportunity for much formal education beyond high school. Dad was a plumber. And he was burdened with, what today we would call, the sort of diseases of despair is the term that they're using now, but drinking and smoking were like the 2 pressure valves for their daily lives. And those are actually, the 2 most destructive things that you can do to self-medicate for what's going on in your life that you can't control and help ameliorate your misery. So, back to the job at the law firm though, the company that we represented at the time had a patent that, cured tobacco in a non-traditional way. And it turns out that one of the main cancer-causing chemicals in tobacco is actually created when tobacco is cured in the United States. It's sort of fermented. And like, without getting too technical, the microbes that ferment the tobacco, the byproduct is something called tobacco-specific nitrosamine, TSNAs. TSNAs were like the big bad of many bad chemicals when you light up a cigarette that you get into your body. But that's the one that the National Institutes of Health was focused on for the longest time. And when we sort of talk about just banning the product altogether, you lose the argument that people are still smoking. And we have a dirty product that could be made safer if we researched and removed those bad things, so that you have the least harmful product on the market. That whole notion got thrown out. The states sued, the big tobacco companies settled, and this is really a deal with the devil. I mean, they paid billions of dollars up front to all of the states. Texas has its own settlement. We sued almost first. Texas, Mississippi, Minnesota, and Florida sued separately, and then the other 46 states have what's called the Master Settlement Agreement. And so from 1997 forevermore, Big Tobacco will pay the states an amount of money according to a formula based on each company's market share in 1997 and the volume of what they're selling today. So RJ Reynolds and Philip Morris and the others pay the state of Texas $500 million a year.
Holy shit.
In damages.
So they're just like, we're selling this, it damages the people that live in your state. We pay repercussions or whatever. Like we pay you money to pay for this damage?
Yes, the future health costs of them continuing to sell their deadly addictive product, the same product that they were selling in 97 when they got sued. They weren't required to change the product at all. And that led to vaping, by the way. We'll get there in a second too.
Okay.
So a cigarette today and a cigarette in 1997 are identical. They're just as bad for you as they used to be.
Quick question. Do you know anything about American spirits?
I do.
Are they actually better or not as harmful?
No, they're not as harmful.
Okay.
They came out in the, I think, late 90s, early 2000s. And what was distinguished them from sort of your run-of-the-mill Big Tobacco premium brand was that they were all natural tobacco. American Big Tobacco cigarettes were cut tobacco and reconstituted tobacco. They take like the bits and pieces of the trimmings and then they'd steam it and roll it into a paper and cut it. And that would be filler in there. And they'd add flavorings and, at some point they manipulated the nicotine content with ammonia and some other stuff. And that was really the evidence of that was one of the reasons they had to settle, because it was just so damning. They weren't just taking tobacco, curing it, cutting it, and rolling it into a cigarette. They had the science down to the nth degree, and they knew exactly what the consumer would be inhaling and why it was bad. And when they manipulated the nicotine content to make up for reducing tar, they call anything that's in the smoke that isn't nicotine is referred to as tar because it builds up. And it's gross. When they came out with light cigarettes, they wanted to reduce the tar, so they had to come up with some way of enhancing the hit of the nicotine. And so American spirits, like if you smoked, like that was a big puff, like compared to a Marlboro or Marlboro Light. But no, it wasn't better. Star Scientific's cigarettes were better in the sense that they had an unmeasurable quantity of TSNAs, tobacco-specific nitrosamines. So they only created a brand of cigarettes to prove the point and to sort of uphold their patent that you could make a cigarette with no TSNAs, and arguably, this is in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Congress eventually was going to give the FDA regulatory authority over tobacco. What the FDA should do is mandate that you make cigarettes less dangerous. They didn't do that. Like I just told you, it's the same damn thing. Now, all of that basically, kind of convinced me that the system is kind of rigged in favor of where the financial interests are. It's not always, the outcome isn't always aimed at making things better for the consumer.
Yeah, otherwise they'd be like, well, we'll just shut you down instead of taking our paycheck every year.
Right. I mean, it's a perverse incentive for the states because the states are in the business now of enforcing the market share for Big Tobacco. The state attorneys general need to protect their settlement, protect that, billions of dollars that stream into the state coffers every year. And one of the things that they do is they went after small tobacco companies that popped up after the settlement. They weren't burdened by these damages, so they could sell their products at a lower price. And over time, that began slowly to erode Big Tobacco's market share. And then all of a sudden, you had enforcement actions all over the country and legislatures passing like specific selective taxes on those companies. Like taxes should be, in fact, our Constitution says it has to be applied evenly and uniformly to everybody.
They're being used as a weapon, basically.
For sure. And the Texas Small Tobacco Coalition, my organization, litigated it all the way to the Texas Supreme Court. We won at the district and at the appeals court level against the state, under the theory that the money that Big Tobacco is paying is damages. Like they voluntarily entered into a settlement of a law enforcement action and paid off the state for wrongdoing. The wrongdoing was based on deception. The companies that came into the industry afterwards haven't deceived anybody about what's in their products. Every smoker now knows. No one's naive about it anymore. And but ultimately, deep pockets won. I think we held them off in the legislature for 4 or 5 legislative sessions, so 8 or 10 years. But eventually one legislative session, the Big Tobacco team had just dozens of really skilled people on their lobby team, and they spent, I think, $1.3 million in that 140-day period to get that selective tax passed. We sued and we won. And then at the Supreme Court level, the court said the legislature's interest is in protecting the settlement and they can do it, full stop. So they dodged the question of whether or not it's okay to selectively tax somebody. And this is incredibly dangerous because if you think about big business interests in other industries, squelching small businesses or upstarts, disruptive technologies, you can see how, not that the legislature would buy it because they're pretty smart and they're not hoodwinked easily, but they're persuadable. And, you wouldn't want to see a big oil company having the ability to get the legislature to pass a selective tax on solar energy, to disadvantage that.
It just destroys competition.
Of course it does. Yeah. And it's the opposite of the sort of free market philosophy that we're supposed to be all about, especially in Texas, but in the United States in general. It's the one thing that distinguishes us from the rest of the world is innovation. And competition is essential to innovation. So where innovation was squelched was the tobacco lawsuit and, the subsequent legislative actions to eliminate companies that had disruptive technologies to make cigarettes less dangerous. Star lost its patent lawsuit against R.J. Reynolds. And so that was like a learning experience for me. I was like in my 20s at the time. I was a junior guy on the team, but I was paying very close attention. And around about, I guess it was 2007, I got a call from my mother that my dad had been losing weight rapidly and was refusing to see a doctor. And he was 57 years old. So I flew down to Houston from DC, where I lived at the time, and he had cancer, and it was 4th stage. So, the terrible decisions that people and millions, 480,000 people die of smoking related illness every year in this country. Still,
yeah, my grandpa died of lung cancer
in 2020, decades after the tobacco lawsuit, people are still dying at a high rate. The option for my dad to switch to an oral lozenge to get nicotine, which is something that Star tried to do, didn't exist because the company was put out of business. The option to have cigarettes that were, introducing TSNAs and other bad chemicals into a system, to have
no detectable
TSNAs. Thanks. I kind of trip over my words because these acronyms kind of clog up my mouth, but that was eliminated. And so I'm not saying that he didn't have a share of responsibility for being a smoker, but if you believe the argument that addiction if it doesn't eliminate, it definitely impacts your free will, because it's a compulsive behavior.
Absolutely.
It's brain chemistry. It's not a rational choice. It's your brain is saying, I need that and I got to get that. And that's the basis of all addiction. Well, when that thing is ubiquitous and it's available at every gas station and 7-Eleven, and he'd been smoking probably since childhood. I know that his brothers all smoked. I know that his dad, who was a Marine, got cigarettes in his rations during the war. It was normalized. It was in every movie. It was part of the culture. So, Steve Maguire Sr. Diagnosed in, Memorial Day weekend, and we lost him by August. And I happened to be, that was the summer of the crash. And I didn't have a whole lot of pressing business. In fact, I think all my clients kind of dried up and went away. So that summer was like a turning point in my life, like emotionally, spiritually, mentally. I went through like a breakdown and a change. Mm-hmm. And I realized that what I'd seen happen to my dad happens to people every single day. It happened to, like you said, your granddad. I know so many friends whose grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, everybody's got somebody who's been touched by it.
Yeah. And again, like my grandpa's in the military, like anybody that was in the military, I feel like it's very, very commonplace, especially in that day and age, for everyone smoked.
Sure. And soldiers famously smoke to bond, to sort of deal with boredom, to deal with fear, stress, just the realities of military life. They got to have something to help them cope with it. And cigarettes were it for a long time. Now, vaping became the thing to replace that, which is kind of where Lucas comes in. I mean, his company, Hometown Hero, aptly named, they do a lot of work with veterans. Or a veteran-owned business. And he started the company, or in part, I think, because he recognized that military guys are sort of uniquely susceptible to smoking at an age where it's not okay anymore in other circumstances, like in mainstream life. But when you're in the military, everybody was smoking. Mm-hmm. And he had the same sort of story where he realized there's something less dangerous out there, something better, and we can give them something cleaner and change their lives and not put them in the position where they're going to get sick. I think the statistics are something like half of the 15 million people who smoke are going to get sick, and half of those people are going to die eventually of smoking related illness. And the research that has come out of the United Kingdom, the UK health system, so their government socialized medicine system, actually prescribes vaping to smokers. They sell it in kiosks in National Health Service hospitals and offices. Unlike the United States, where it's been sort of persecuted through misinformation.
I vape myself now, but I'm so confused as to like, is it better? Should I be worried?
It's 90, according to a very often cited peer-reviewed journal article in, I think, The Lancet, which is like their New England Journal of Medicine. Vaping is 95% less harmful than cigarettes. So even if that's only partially true, it's progress. But you run into two main philosophies here. There are prohibitionists who think that we should just forbid these things and stigmatize them and the people that do them. And then there's harm reductionists. Like, I'm in the harm reductionist column. I think that if it's going to be on the market, it's got to be made as, you can't use the word safe, but least harmful possible. Mm-hmm. So let me circle back around to my dad, though. So I went to work, I think 2-3 years later, I started working with a company that had a patented molecule. It was a biosciences company that was using nanoparticles of gold as a delivery vehicle for chemo drugs to treat cancer, to treat solid tumors like the one that killed my dad, or the ones that killed my dad. The chemotherapy can kill cancer, but it also kills everything else. And what the Dr. Larry Tamarkin at Cytomine Sciences, who was a career NIH scientist, had figured out that if you found kind of an inert substance and bonded it chemically to the chemotherapy molecule, and then sheathed that molecule in water. The chemo drug that would ordinarily damage your organs as it was injected into your body would pass through them. Like he used the term invisible to the organs and be sort of pushed into the tumors, which all have lots of holes in them called fenestrations. And Texas has a state agency called the Cancer Prevention Research Institute, which is a grant writing body. And the voters of the state approved a constitutional amendment setting aside $1 billion or some amount that I literally don't remember now, but a lot, to write grants for cancer research. So the company was based in Maryland, in the DC suburbs. I got connected to them through a friend who knew about my dad and said, you were talking to me about this tumor in his aorta and in his head, these tumors that killed him. And I've got this friend who is general counsel of that company, Cytomune, and I want you to meet them. So it seemed almost like fate that we needed to work together. And they didn't have any understanding or visibility into Texas or the legislative process or CPRIT, but I was coming down here to do some work anyway, and I tried to help them. And they applied for a grant and couldn't get it. There was a lot of, I think it's fair to say that the company was disappointed that the peer review process that looked at their application for a grant didn't see the value that they saw in the technology. I think the drug was called Aurimune, AURIMMUNE. And we failed to get the grant. The company is still going though, and they're still struggling to get the funding to test their drug. And if the drug is successful, it's a game changer because it could take solid mass tumors and shrink them and make, a death sentence into a manageable disease by, just getting these injections.
And without making you super sick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my dad made it through 2 or 3 chemo treatments before he died, and they were brutal. So you're already, and the deal was there. And this is just the terrible thing about American medicine. The doctors really weren't giving you a lot of like, here are your odds. 50% of the people that take this chemo make it a year. There were no facts to base your decision on. It was like, we think we can get you 6 months to a year if you do this treatment. And they downplayed the side effects. And I have a lot to say about like how much better we could do, as Americans in like demanding better information so we can make more informed choices. But, and so that set me up for, fast forward a couple of years and vape emerges on the scene. And the companies that had been part of the Texas Small Tobacco Coalition started making vaping products. And at that time, this is 13 years ago, I guess, 14 years ago, I met my wife, and she had been in culinary school. And, kind of like military people, kitchen staff and chefs have brutal jobs, and they smoke and they drink. And Leslie had been kind of a lifelong smoker. But she was worried about it because her father had died of heart disease, and she wanted to quit. And at that time, a company called Enjoy came out with a product that looked like a cigarette. There was like the little filter part of the cigarette was the nicotine cartridge, and the barrel or the white part of the cigarette was the battery. And you plug it in and charge it up, and you'd have to replace it. You had to fiddle with it. And it wasn't very good. It didn't taste great, but it definitely like took care of her nicotine cravings. And year after year, vaping technology and the products available in the market got better and better and better. And eventually she just stopped smoking cigarettes altogether. So, at the time we had a catering business and she was a chef. It was like, my palate has come back. Like, I didn't realize how food was tasting wrong when I was smoking, and how my choices about how I was seasoning that food were impacted by my smoking. And now that I'm not putting smoke in my mouth and messing up my taste buds and my olfactory senses, I see the difference. That was like the first noticeable thing. The rest of it was just more, better respiration, better oxygenation, just feeling healthier, not feeling like she compulsively had to light up. And she's healthier for it, and her doctor encouraged it. So the vape industry really hit kind of a peak in, say, 2015-ish. And around that time was when we started seeing the challenges from big tobacco come in the form of hostile legislation. And that hostile legislation was backed by sort of public relations efforts that were cleverly disguised, I think, as like public health interest statements. And what was perverse about this is that the public health community that we rely on, to be advocates for us, I don't want to overstate this. I don't think they're bad, but the Cancer Society, the Lung and Heart Associations, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, all started arguing that vaping needed to be banned, or flavors needed to be banned, or it needed to be taxed highly or eliminated altogether because kids were getting a hold of it. And I thought, well, that's really backwards. The way we regulate substances in this country isn't for teenagers. Teenagers are not allowed to buy alcohol. You can't go into a bar when you're under 21 and buy a beer, or a liquor store and buy a bottle of liquor, or into a 7-Eleven and buy a wine cooler, because all of those businesses have licenses, and those licenses are at risk if you violate the rules and you don't check an ID and make sure that the person doing the buying is of age. So I kind of felt like, the public health interest groups that the vape industry refers to as antis, the anti-nicotine zealots, were fighting the last war against big tobacco, because they thought that vape was like the stealthy new cigarette that was going to addict a new generation of kids and perpetuate big tobacco's profits. And they are partially right about that, by the way. But the industry in 2015 was companies like Lucas's. It was small businesses that were disrupting an established order in American industry that pays billions of dollars to state regulators, state legislatures every year for its market share, and is ubiquitous and is in every convenience store and every big box store, and up until recently, even drugstores. And vaping was putting a big dent in their profits. So much of a dent that I don't know if it was this past cycle or the one before last, but I think it was 2017. The Texas Comptroller's Office, which issues a revenue report every biennium, every 2 years, because we have 2-year cycles.
A revenue report on
what taxes what revenues the state brings in. Okay. Like, they'll forecast how much they think they're going to get, and then in the next report they'll say, this is what we actually collected and this is what we forecast for next time. And you base the state budget on what that available revenue is going to be. Gotcha. It's broken down line item by line item. So, all the state oil and gas transfer taxes and all the sales taxes and all of the excise taxes on different things are listed. And in that comptroller's report, between 1 year over another, and I want to say it was 17 over 18 or 18 over 19, there was an 11% decline in cigarette excise tax revenues. So, think about that. Like, in a 1 year period, you have an 11% shortfall. Mm-hmm. And what accounts for that? It isn't that all of a sudden smokers are paying attention to public service announcements. Yeah. It's that they were switching to vaping. And then the heat was on. It was a full-on effort to either enact taxes that would make the difference between vaping and smoking cigarettes kind of neutral, so that the consumer would either, like, vaping would be more expensive, so they would be more likely to default to cigarettes. Some of the proposals were to eliminate flavors under the theory that kids are attracted to flavors. But like 99% of what vape stores sell to adults are flavors, because like Leslie discovered, when you quit smoking cigarettes, you get your sense of taste back. And all of a sudden, like tobacco flavored vape liquids don't taste good. And
no, they don't.
They don't. You want something that tastes good. When
Yeah.
your taste buds come back, it's like, oh God, that's gross. Mm-hmm. It's like when you quit smoking cigarettes for months and then you're at a party and you take a puff and you're like, oh, why did I do that? That's exactly the reaction. But the public health groups are saying this is a stealthy way of big tobacco doing what they did in the 90s with Joe Camel, coming up with candy flavored cigarettes to addict teenagers. Now, maybe big tobacco has tried to co-opt the vaping industry, and we know that because Altria bought a 33% or 30% stake in Juul, which is a pod system, a closed system, and Juul became virtually ubiquitous overnight.
Yeah, and so Altria was formerly Philip Morris. Right?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Altria is like I guess it's like the parent company, but Philip Morris is the name that we all know it by.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was sort of like the self-fulfilling prophecy. But what Altria was doing was buying a stake in this disruptive technology, and not a controlling stake, like a third. But that was enough to activate the antis, quote unquote, to really come after us. And their facts were just simply wrong. But it's very difficult to counter a narrative when they're bringing in teenagers who say, I got addicted to this. You know, you got some doe-eyed 14-year-old who's, sitting in front of a Senate committee and talking about how hard it is to quit juuling. That's of course, everybody in that legislature just about is a parent, and they're obviously nobody wants to do anything that is going to harm a kid, but it's not really an evidence-based persuasion technique. It's an emotional-based and political tool. The facts were on our side, and it was, mostly out of a lot of hard work and a lot of, putting studies in front of people that they hadn't seen and bringing witnesses that they hadn't heard from. People, in companies like the American Vaping Company up in Pflugerville, Justin Surif, who's a stakeholder in our group, came down to testify in the last Senate Health and Human Services Committee hearing about, what his customers, how it's changed their lives. And Justin Gibson from the Vintage Vaping Company, even better, he's a shop owner. And I love Justin and Felicity because they're, when you walk into their shop, it does look like an old-fashioned sort of cigar store, except not smoky. And it's not at all like a head shop. This is their probably profile demographic or middle-class people, middle-aged people who are former smokers. And along the wooden bar that runs the length of his shop are all of these cigarette packs that they've stapled to the wall with a date on them and the name of the customer, because that was when they turned over their cigarettes and they bought their vape, and that was their last cigarette. And so, you've got the vaping community / industry that believes that they are helping people save their own lives. And then you've got the public health community that is convinced that vaping is just a tool to addict kids. And both of those, actually, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I have to, both of those are partly correct. Mm-hmm. Our solution to keep kids from getting a hold of vaping products was enhanced licensing and enforcement. Like, before you ban the product and take our adult choices away from us as adult consumer citizens of this democracy, why not try making certain that anybody who sells to a kid pays the price for that first? Mm-hmm. And what I didn't recognize, and this was a model bill that came to us from the Vapor Technology Association, which is the nationwide effort focused on Congress, but they give us model bills that we can use to help further the industry's interests as discussion pieces. And a member of the legislature liked the idea that we would treat vape like we treat cigarettes. every store that sells cigarettes in Texas or tobacco products has a tobacco license from the comptroller's office. And like if you go into an HEB and the locker that they've got all their tobacco products in it, on one end, all the licenses are sort of in, plastic sleeves where you can see them. Well, that is a regulatory tool. The company has to maintain that license, and that license can only be maintained if the company, follows the regulations and the law. If they're caught breaking those regulations and law, they get penalties. And the penalties can be, I'm giving a general, not the specifics, but like, first time you're caught selling to a kid, there's a fine you have to pay. Maybe the second time it's a much bigger fine. And then, third time you lose your license and you can no longer legally sell those products in the state. What I didn't realize is that the open systems segment of the industry, the mom and pop vape shops and the companies that manufacture e-liquids, were very suspicious of any bill. Firstly, there's a cultural thing, especially in Texas. Very libertarian people. Very anti-government people, and they don't want anybody telling them what to do. And they're completely like evangelically convinced that what they're doing is saving lives, and anything that threatens that is going to provoke a visceral reaction. So one of the it's not really even wasn't really even like a continuously operating trade association, but the amateur trade association, for lack of a better term, that had represented their industry. Every 2 years, they'd hire a lobbyist and they come to the Capitol and they talk about vape. They were convinced that this was some sort of stealthy way to put them out of business. And I was stunned, because the intent was really to protect us as an industry from, bad actors who just didn't care, who they were selling their stuff to. And by and large, the enforcement actions that we saw, the FDA published their enforcement actions. They go and do sting operations. Mostly those sting operations produced results in big box stores and convenience stores, which makes sense because there are so many of them. But vape shops, which are typically small businesses, run by the people who own them, have a much more vested interest in not selling to kids, because the communities that they operate in won't tolerate it. And they, as individuals, don't believe in it. Mm-hmm. But, through a series of my failure was to understand where they were coming from, and find a way to explain what we were really trying to do. And I couldn't compensate for their sort of anti-government perspective anyway. I'm not partisan in my professional life, but I'm definitely not a conservative, and I don't know that I'm a libertarian. I don't really even know how to categorize myself, but I'm not anti-government. I think it's got its place. It should do what it can do well, and then get out of the way the rest of the time. Mm-hmm. And so we failed to get the licensing bill passed, which was really unfortunate, because kids were still buying.
And this bill was aimed at increase fines for people selling to minors.
Yeah, creating a licensing system that if you were going to sell the stuff in the state, you had to get the license. And if you had the license, then if you sold to kids, ultimately you'd lose it, and then you couldn't be in that business anymore.
Okay, I understand that.
So we're coming back into a legislative session. Oh gosh, I don't know what number this is. It's the Texas meets every 2 years. So this next legislature will be the 87th regular legislative session in 2021. And this is going to be a very weird year because of COVID. Like ordinarily, the lobbyists that I would retain on behalf of the trade association, and I would spend a lot of time in the building. We would be talking to members of the legislature and their staffs on an ongoing basis. And the dialogue starts well before they come into session in January, the year before. So that we have a clear understanding of, who, where people's ideas are, where their heads are at, and how to communicate to them, make sure that we've educated all of them on our ideas. And this year we're concerned about the same things. We're concerned about tax. We're concerned about flavor bans. We're concerned about, any legislation that's going to come down the pike that's going to make it harder to do business in as a vape store or vapor manufacturer in Texas.
Hey, FIA listeners. Just before this episode is over, I want to give you one more quick friendly reminder to please like and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast player. Thanks again. And you said they meet every 2 years, specifically in regards to vaping?
No, the state legislature in Texas meets in odd numbered years for 140 days, full stop.
Okay.
And in that 140 days, the only thing they actually have to pass by our Constitution is the budget. So the pattern has been, and I've worked in the state legislature here off and on for the last 30 years, they'll get a lot done in that 140 days. And if there's a priority that does not get accomplished, like if there's a budget problem and they can't get the budget bill passed or some other, important thing, the governor can call them back for 30-day sessions. But the point is we have a very limited window of opportunity / danger where they're in session. And all of the decisions that the industry is going to have to live with are going to be made in that 140 days probably.
So what do you do to get in and get your voice heard? You actually show up? Or
for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. There are people, lobbyists have a bad name, but we've had some really great ones that have worked for us over the years. And I've done that job myself in the past. These are people that make it their business to have a professional and personal connection to the staff people and to the members of the legislature, the House and the Senate. And it's not what popular culture imagines it to be. It's not guys in $1,000 suits with briefcases of money. Although there is money in the system, and that's a whole other subject. It's you and I have worked together. I represent this client on this one issue. Here are the facts that my client needs you to know. And so much of it is based on providing evidence-based information. So because the lobbyist job is to petition the government. It's your constitutional right, by the way. One of the things that we wrote up in our letter to King George in 1776 was you wouldn't hear our petitions. And so it's written into the Bill of Rights, the right to petition the government. And what we do in modern practice is we hire somebody. You hire a lawyer to go to court, you hire a lobbyist to go before your legislature or Congress. And
how do you get heard when you show up?
Well, firstly, those people have the relationship and make the appointments. And so a lobbyist would bring a witness. There's two pieces. We have 181 members of that legislature, 150 House members, 31 senators. There's also a Speaker of the House, Lieutenant Governor, and a governor. All of those entities, for lack of a better word, need to be, to one degree or another, touched. Lobbyist job is to make sure all of that is accomplished. And what they'll typically do is if they have a meeting with somebody who's like on a specific committee, they'll bring a witness with them and they'll say, this is how the bill that's going to be in front of your committee impacts your office's constituency, like your area of the state that you represent. They will give the facts about however many businesses are in that industry in that person's district. And here, by the way, is a business owner. So we would bring, for example, Justin Gibson and Justin Surif, two Justins from the Austin area, brought them to the Capitol and had them, and also to Congress, had them meet with legislative offices, because if all you're reading is the newspaper, you're not getting the full picture. And the staff people, especially when they've got 1,000 issues they have to worry about, hearing that one-to-one is much more impactful. And the other piece of I'm oversimplifying, but the other piece of sort of lobbying craft is that when a bill goes in front of a committee, that's an open hearing process and witnesses are typically heard. What you want to do is bring the people who are the best representatives of your point of view in front of that committee, who can make their point in an impactful way. And like I gave the example of Senator Lois Kolkhorst's Health and Human Services Committee hearing on vaping. I think that the committee came in having heard all about Juul and having heard from the antis in the public health community and being very concerned. And then they came out of it with an additional perspective, not a different perspective, an additional perspective that their own constituents, especially working class people who smoke, were going to be negatively affected by anything they do to restrict vaping and put people back on cigarettes. They didn't know that before. And the witnesses that we brought gave them that perspective.
Okay.
So that's sort of a piece of what a trade association has to do. And my job is to educate the public enough, make sure the industry understands the legislation that's we're going to be confronted with in the next session, and then try to make sure we have a organized, unified response. We get the best people to come. What's weird about this coming year is that we don't really know how many open hearings we're going to have, like in person, because of COVID. You know, typically that building is like I think of it as like a really big high school where, you know, there are a lot of people in and out of there every single day. The staff people, the members, the professional advocates and lobbyists that represent nonprofits and corporate interests and pressure groups, and then busloads of school kids and senior citizens and tourists. And, well, that's not a situation where it's practical to be socially distant. But you also have like a process and laws that have to be followed. The public has to have access to the process. And I know that the House Administration Committee, the speaker, our new speaker, Speaker Phelan, and Lieutenant Governor runs the Senate, Speaker runs the House. They've got to figure out what's going to work for them. And I know that they're working on it, but we don't know yet what that's going to look like for us. Ordinarily, we would show up on opening day and somebody would be in the building every single day working on their list of issues the whole session. Don't know how that's going to go this time.
Okay.
So, and it's kind of hard to do committee hearings by Zoom.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare.
Well, especially when there's like a significant component of the House that's convinced that Zoom is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. I heard that was a new one on me, and I don't know where that comes from, but if they're worried about it, I'm worried about it.
So we talked a lot about vapor there. And it's all really interesting. And so your hemp, the reason you also want hemp is harm reduction. Same reason.
Yeah, it's the same thing. I mean, vape is a harm reduction product. It helps people on cigarettes. I think that hemp and maybe ultimately marijuana, if we will have bills that legalize marijuana. I'm not working on.
You're totally confident about that?
Oh, I know. They've been introduced.
Okay.
And I don't know that they'll be passed. I think they've got like higher hurdles in this state than maybe other states. But what the marijuana, the pro marijuana forces have going for them is a shift in cultural attitudes towards marijuana, because my generation, the Just Say No people, and like the whole law enforcement industrial complex that was built up around suppressing marijuana seems to have like fallen apart.
It's just fascinating to me how that it's so crazy.
I mean, it's crazy, but there was a method to it. Like it's the 1970 federal crime bill that President Nixon pushed through Congress really like doubled down on the war against drugs, and Ronald Reagan sort of gave that a shot in the arm, and billions and billions and billions of dollars flowed from the federal government to sheriff's departments and city police forces for drug interdiction. And along with that, there was a sort of a public information warfare, stigmatizing it and stigmatizing people that used it. And what that resulted in is, like the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matters movement is partly concerned with mass incarceration of Black and brown people for crimes predicated by marijuana. But it's also, I think a cynical read and maybe an accurate one would be that starting with Nixon, conservatives saw marijuana as the hook that they could use to control minorities in this country. And that's how we have, more than 1 million people incarcerated in this country now. And that's how we've got this situation where you can't drive, your car down the road in some places if you're Black or brown without being at risk of being harassed or worse, much worse. Well, that's not okay. And I think we've gotten along enough in 2021 that the consensus is that the motive force behind the war on drugs is dead.
Mm-hmm.
It's discredited in the eyes of most people. And I think the polling numbers are in 60 and 70%. Whether or not the elected officials in Texas have caught up to that yet matters. They've got to be responsive to the people who vote. In Texas, the people who vote most reliably up until this last election are the people who vote in the Republican primary. And the ones that are the majority voters in the Republican primary, so 50% of the narrow subset of voters that voted for the winning candidates, they're the ones they're paying attention to the most. They're also paying attention to their sheriffs and their police departments because those are important institutions in their districts. And I think we can probably count on sheriff's departments having mixed views about it. In fact, one of our companies, after the federal government had legalized hemp, a California company had a container, a shipping container on a truck crossing into Texas through El Paso, and it was seized by the sheriff's departments. So and they arrested the poor driver. It was a legal product. The paperwork that's required by federal law was there, but the sheriff's department is almost like, I think it was like muscle memory. If you smell that smell, then that's the cartel, that's El Chapo, and we got to stop it. Now that's a couple of years ago now, it's 18 months or 2 years ago now. And that was actually kind of a precedent setting case where we used it to make sure that every other sheriff's department in the state knew that you can't rely on the smell test anymore. You really need lab tests like what Santi provides to make sure that you know the difference between what's legal and what's not legal. And here's the paperwork you should be looking for. But that company had to suffer the loss of that truckload because it sat in the heat and was ruined. And that poor guy spent, I don't know, a weekend or a week in jail.
Damn.
For no damn reason. So what I'm saying is those sheriffs that have that kind of muscle memory attitude about the war on drugs, you can count on them to say, hey, I don't know about all this legalization stuff, but I got to tell you, here's what I'm worried about. Mm-hmm. And what they're worried about is crime associated with it. Mm-hmm. It's very much like prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s. Al Capone got rich by being a badass gangster because he was pushing an illegal product, and guns and violence were how you got that done. And then we legalized it, and all of a sudden the badass gangsters got into some other business. I think that'll probably happen with marijuana, but not necessarily there yet.
What do you think the odds of getting hemp legalized in Texas soon are?
So hemp is legal.
Okay, hemp is already legal.
The hemp's legislative agenda is a little different. I think what we want to do this session is make sure that we're able to remediate when we have a hot crop. And we don't necessarily need a bill to be passed for that. That might be able to be done by a regulation at the Texas Department of Agriculture and the State Department of Health Services. I'm not sure which would control, but we're going to go educate the legislators because they're the ones who pass the laws. And they don't just pass laws. They have what we call an oversight role. Like they pay attention to how the agencies are actually executing the laws that they pass. And they want to hear from the agencies and from the industry about how it's going. So we expect that we'll probably have a hearing in the Agriculture Committee about Texas hemp and where things are going. And we will use that hearing to raise some of the issues that we are bringing forward in our video series, Texas Hemp from Seed to Shelf, which I'll send you a link to.
For sure. Do you know when it'll come out? Do you have a timeline?
Yeah, we'll probably roll out the first couple of them in January. And they'll maybe be like, one a month from there forward. Part of the benefit of working with a college student is that he's got some time during the break. So we're going to try to get as much as the winter break, much done in the next couple of weeks as we can. But it's not like, I don't have a tight production schedule, and I'm not in a hurry. I want to get it done right. And, kind of make this an educational mission for him as much as it is for us. And I have to point out that Santi Labs is underwriting the work. They're paying him a fair rate, by the way. We're not exploiting him. It happens that I am a fraternity advisor, and I'm a member of Zeta Psi fraternity, came here to UT Austin and joined. It was a great experience. Older guys provided opportunities for me and kind of mentored me. So that's sort of what I'm doing with Kyle Decker. our video guy.
Mm-hmm.
And it just happened that we got into a conversation about CBD one day. And then I found out about his work and I saw it and I was incredibly impressed. A college kid, this is interesting. I think college, we called it radio, television, film back in the day, but I think the jargon has changed. The technology that they use every day is like light years ahead of what, you'll see in a more traditional PR firm. And he's able to do more on his laptop and more efficiently than I could raise the money to pay for it in $5,000 or $6,000 a month to crank some stuff out. So it's a fun project for me because it brings together like the educational mission of a trade association, educate the public. It also sort of helps build our mind share group. Like I think that he and anyone else I work with on this project will go on to have the experiences that maybe I got working at Bell, Boyd and Lloyd, learning about the issues around the cigarette settlement. So to me, that's sort of like bringing it all full circle.
Mm-hmm. And we're almost out of time here.
Okay.
I have another question. Unless you have to go.
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, how do you feel about? Would you want? I'm assuming you would want marijuana even legalized in Texas.
Okay, so talking to Jay Maguire, the executive director of the Texas Hemp Federation, and talking to Jay Maguire, informed dude, two different things. So let me take off my official hat because I don't want to commit my stakeholder group at the Federation to taking a position on marijuana. That's not their instructions to me. I would like to see marijuana legalized, but I also want to see a lot more science on marijuana because there's a whole lot of hokey going on with pot. You don't have any freaking idea what you're getting a lot of the time. People that I know who are regular pot smokers, kind of rely on their underground network to get them what they want.
They're dude.
Yeah. But you go to a dispensary, for example, like in Canada. I was in Vancouver a couple of years ago, and there's a dispensary on every freaking corner. They've got these it's like green cross signs, and you walk in there, and it's like a pharmacy, and they've got every strain identified, and they'll tell you, sort of what the characteristics of that strain are and what you use it for and what to expect. There needs to be a whole lot less lore and legend around usage of the herb and a whole lot more science around the usage of the herb. We're sort of looking at it like you go into a wine shop or you go into Central Market's, beer counter, and the resident expert on wine or beer is going to tell you, the terroir and the varietals and what it tastes like. We're not consuming marijuana for the experience of a glass of wine or a craft beer. We're consuming it for a chemical, and the amount of that chemical and what it does to the human body needs to be studied by medical science. So that's one thing I have to say. And I'm saying that because my doctor, Dr. Gary Warrants at Red River Family Practice, is like, I really don't want people coming to me looking for a prescription for marijuana because I don't know what it does as a scientist.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And now I don't think that should change your or my or anybody's opportunity to try it for like self-help when we know that like marijuana is so much less harmful than opioids or alcohol. For sure, alcohol. Mm-hmm. I mean, we talked about my dad's cigarette smoking, but it was the alcohol that really screwed him, on an ongoing basis in his life and made his depression and mental illness so much worse. And I saw that in myself in my younger years when I was, drinking regularly, just how my decisions were influenced by it and how my physical health was influenced by it.
I deal with it too.
Yeah.
5 days without a drink right now.
Good for you. Yeah, I drink kind of sparingly these days. Yeah. I mean, not to say that I certainly won't enjoy partying with my friends again when COVID is over, but I don't drink every single day. And I kind of realize the more I get away from it, it's like, a couple of drinks is one thing, 5 drinks is another. And that's, for a lot of people, that's like the reality, especially right now. People are drinking a lot more than they used to, I hear. You see a lot of my friends' Facebook posts, joking about it's wine 30 at noon. And I don't blame them, but it does really impact your body in a pretty negative way. And it makes your depression worse in the long run.
It's tough to deal with. I always end up like, it gets worse and worse. Like I'll take a big break and then it's like, okay, then I'll drink like what you would consider a normal person to drink, like whatever that is, like where they drink socially or they just have a couple, but then it kind of just creeps in farther and farther until I'm like, oh, okay, like now I'm doing it every day again.
Right. Right. And what you just said is probably true for a lot of people.
Exactly.
I mean, don't feel bad about yourself because of that, because that's like a normal experience. But I don't know you well, but I get the sense that you're pretty self-aware and capable of like making informed decisions about your health. One of the reasons I'm probably sitting here right now. So, I have every faith that you'll get that figured out.
Appreciate that, Jay.
You're welcome, man.
Well, it was awesome to have you on, man. I thought this was super interesting. I learned a ton.
Thanks.
I wish we could talk longer, but we've been talking for about an hour and 15.
No, really?
Yeah.
It seems like I just got here.
Yeah.
Well, I'm always glad to come back, and maybe after the session's over, I'll come back and tell you how things went and where I think things are going to go.
That would be awesome. I'd love that.
And I meant to bring you a bottle of Reset, by the way. It's not that I'm repping the company or anything, but they gave me a small supply of it, and I'll make sure I get you some because it helps my anxiety a lot. I definitely feel calmer, and I've got a lot of faith in the science behind their product.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to try it. Like I said, I love CBD, and it definitely even helps, like I said, with the drinking stuff, like at night, if like you're just to take it, just you chill out,
Yeah. Well, I mean, sort of helps me sort of shut my head off a little bit. I don't feel intoxicated, but I feel calmer.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think my anxiety is right below the surface all the time right now with COVID, because it's not just like, I'm not just worried about the virus. It's the shutdown and money and jobs and how it's impacting my kids' school and all this stuff. Everybody's going through this. And so, the least harmful option seems to be taking that CBD. Rather than that, really good looking bourbon right there, because it won't just be one bourbon.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Jay.
All right, man. Thanks for having me.
That was awesome. Hey, the cameras died, but it's fine. Like, I'll just show still images for the last 5 minutes. I need to get hardwired things. These don't run off wall power.
Oh,
They
really?
just died in the last, when you heard them beep, they
Yeah,
literally died.
that was the end of it.